Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everyone to today's special webinar, Palliative Workplace Stress, Qualitative Research Data About It, and Considering the Benefits of Self-Compassion to Address It. I'm Andrew Andresco, Project Coordinator for Transforming Chaplaincy, and we are delighted you could all join us. We had approximately close to 300 registrants, so we're really thrilled that you all could join us. Some housekeeping instructions right off the top. You are listening in using your computer speaker system by default and are muted. Should you have any technical questions regarding your audio or visual, please type those into the chat box located in the platform's dashboard. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions for our presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of that same control panel anytime during the presentation, and we'll get to those at the end of both of these presentations. We'll have a Q&A session. And with that, I'd like to introduce Paul Gauschutt, convener of Transforming Chaplaincy's Hospice and Palliative Care Spiritual Care Network and research chaplain with M Fairview Health. Paul?
Thank you, Andy. I echo that welcome that you graciously offered, and big word of thanks to you, Andy, for all that you do to make these happen. If you would mind going to the next slide, please. So if you are not yet a part of our Hospice Palliative Spiritual Care Research Network, it's free. We'd love to have you be a part of us, to connect, to inform through things like these webinars, through the latest peer-reviewed research, and then to even be a place where we explore the possibility of doing investigations together and to coordinate that among us. This is our, I know they've been around for a while, but this is, I think, our main voyage into offering a QR code. So if you're a smartphone person, please give that a scan and join us for that, and we'll make sure that that happens. Next slide, please. So today's webinar is sort of a happy accident. Our friends at the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine were going to host an in-person as well as a virtual online offering of the annual assembly, and the Omicron variant hit pretty hard and it was moved to exclusively being virtual. So in that process, some presentations had to be selected to no longer be offered in the virtual setting. These are two of those presentations. So we're gonna tip it off here with a presentation called Right There With You. We'll talk about that in a second. And then our other presenters on the second half, Dr. Edwards, Reverend Hyman, and Dr. Bostic will be here to talk to us a little bit about self-compassion, some research behind that, some conceptual structures for that, as well as to give you a chance to briefly practice that for yourself in your work. So next slide, please. So we're going to start off with this presentation, Right There With You. This is subtitle is The Challenges for Inpatient Palliative Care Chaplains and Interdisciplinary Team Members on the Palliative Care Team during the onset of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So this was funded by our friends, the sponsors of this webinar, Transforming Chaplaincy. So presenting today are myself, and then I just want to make sure I got to know both Tim and Dirk for a long time, but I want to make sure that I get these details just right. So Tim Onset, who is joining us by phone, Tim serves as the Executive Director of Physicians of the Wellness Collaborative. He's an Army Reserve chaplain, a Ph.D. student here in Minnesota, and with the Division of Health Policy and Management, connected with the School of Public Health. Dirk Labauchain is a research chaplain with supportive oncology at Rush University Medical Center, and Tim and Dirk and myself all got to know each other through the Transforming Chaplaincy Research Fellowship. Next slide, please. So we, like many people, when this COVID first hit, amid the tragedy of it, we had this question of, could we gather some data related to palliative care chaplains? So as many of us know, early March in the United States, this is when it really started hitting hard. So we were fortunate that Transforming Chaplaincy was able to fund us doing 10 interviews with inpatient palliative care chaplains. And halfway through the interviews, I took this screenshot of the Johns Hopkins dashboard. And if all of us are keeping track, which I know we are, at that point, halfway through our interviews, just over 60,000 people that we knew of had died. And now we're approaching 1 million. I think I just did a factor of 15 with that. Next slide, please. So we did our best. Though 10 isn't a huge number for qualitative interviews, we tried to get a sense of chaplains throughout the United States, and Dirk's going to tell you a little bit more about that.
So we can do the next slide. Thank you. Thanks, Paul, and good to be here with all of you. So I'll just tell us a little bit more about the methodology of this study and then lead us off into discussing the results. So as Paul mentioned, we interviewed palliative care chaplains. You can see a little bit about their demographics on this slide. And we did so through semi-structured interviews that were audio recorded and then transcribed. And as Paul mentioned, we tried to kind of at least get a geographic representation from different palliative care chaplains that were working at the hotspots that were present at the time. And so once we had those recordings transcribed, we started analyzing them, and we did so thematically. As you can see there, developing different codes and then also finding representative quotes from the specific interviews in order to refine the themes that we came up with. Next slide. And so we found that the data was quite rich, actually so rich that we ended up deciding to divide up the project or the results of the project into two separate manuscripts. So the first one focused on the patient family experience. And as you can see that manuscript has already been published fairly recently in the Journal of Palliative Medicine. So if you're interested in reading about that specifically, please go and look it up. Next slide. So getting into the results of what we found. So the first theme that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on discussing is about the triaging and the changing of practices that we heard the chaplains share with us in these interviews. So around the triaging of care. So as most of us probably experienced during the onset of the pandemic and the development of it, there was a quite increased need for spiritual care, and not only for the patients, but also for the families who were just so distraught and overwhelmed with knowing that their family members were going through increased suffering and that they were so isolated and not able to see them. But coinciding with that is also that many health systems decided to keep certain staff from working on site, and that was also the case for chaplains. And so for these 10 palliative care chaplains that we interviewed, they really had to deal with how to provide the spiritual care needed when they were or oftentimes one of the few chaplains that were actually working on site. And so that really challenged them in needing to provide care coordination in a new level to serve as a liaison in ways that they might not have had to do before. And one of the ways that they try to do that is just to utilize whatever resources they had available to them. And so obviously that caused them to work much harder than they've had to work in the past. But they also had to be quick to refer patients to the resources that were available. So for example, one of the chaplains told us that their Catholic priest on site was able to provide care. And so one way to kind of triage is to just refer all of the Catholic patients to the priest, knowing that they would at least be able to receive some of the rituals or sacraments that were really important to them. And if there were any overlaps, for example, with social workers, using those resources as well. So the quote there from one of the chaplains, you can see it on the screen. So whenever a consult would come in for COVID, I was on their floor, and yet I was so overwhelmed that I could not get to them. And so this also challenged us in terms of the kind of practice that the kind of care that the chaplains were able to provide. As we all know, personal touch, presence, or touch and personal presence, it's so important for the spiritual care that we provide, and with the PPE and the masks and not being able to enter rooms, this was a quite prevalent theme for us, chaplains speaking to not being able to provide the care that they're used to doing. So having to rethink it, how to provide it through the phone. And then coinciding with that is the need for increased staff support. So one of the chaplains said where they usually would provide about 10 or use 10% of their time to provide care to staff, this increased to 50% of their time. Next slide. And so another theme is how all of these pressures, the professional pressures that the chaplains talk with us about, really just kind of combined and making it quite a challenging time for them to provide the work that they were expected to do. And especially speaking from these hotspots, the importance for them to just, get up and get to work and be present as much as they're able to, even though the average day that the chaplains described to us were just so overwhelming and so heavy with the kind of care and heaviness of the grief that they encountered and the need that they tried to attend to. And so obviously there were amplified grief that we heard. So not only the grief that patients and families experience, but also the chaplains talk with us about how the care that they provide really triggered their own grief in dealing with that, and obviously thinking about their own families and kind of collective grief that they're experiencing. But we also heard about ways that they were really trying to cope through it. So whether it was gratitude practices or reflective writing, we heard the chaplain speak to the importance of trying to deal with their grief at work and not take it home with them. There was immense uncertainty, not only about the future, sorry about the siren there, but also their own job security. They were asked to do unimaginable things. So one of the chaplains shared with the first staff member that died at their hospital, they were tasked with writing the prayers for the memorial service, and how immensely challenging that was for them to do. I mentioned staff support, but we also heard about staff support among the immediate palliative care team. And there was a sense of camaraderie among the team, but things were also so different that it was really challenging to kind of lean on each other and support each other in the way they used to. So, several people were working from home, or you weren't able to share offices in the way that you used to. So that kind of assumed space where you can support each other, assumed schedules that you had to do so wasn't there anymore. And then lastly, several chaplains told us about how they were expected to have different schedules. If they were used to only doing a certain amount of on-calls, they were now asked to do that more. And so that change of schedule was challenging, but it also went along with a sense of grief, because some of them had to let go of things that were really meaningful for them to do. For example, research projects or being involved in educational endeavors, and needing to let go of that was challenging as well. And so we can go to the next slide, and I'm going to hand it off to Tim to talk about the remaining themes.
Yeah, thank you, Dirk. Hello, everyone. My name is Tim. I'll be talking some of the moral distress, burnout, and moral injury pieces of what came out of this project. I apologize. I am audio only today. I had an unexpected issue come up, so I'm in between places and not at the office. So before I talk about the components of moral distress that came up out of these interviews, I want to at least give everyone a brief definition so you have some context as to where we're working from. If you want to look into some of the foundational work in moral distress from a definitional perspective, there's Jaminton, there's Varco et al. And Ann Hamrick. And the definition I'm going to give you is kind of bringing different parts of all those definitions together, and it's out of an article by Elizabeth Epstein and colleagues in 2019, where they brought forward a new moral distress measure. And there's 5 key components of moral distress as it's been studied in healthcare. The first is the complicity in wrongdoing. Second is kind of having a lack of voice. Third is wrongdoing associated with professional, not personal values, repeating negative experiences, and there can be 3 levels of root causes, which can be patient, unit, and system. And in terms of what we saw in our interviews with these palliative care chaplains early in the pandemic, is that there was a lot of, and going back to those definitions, there was a lot of decision making that felt very forced in terms of things were day by day and things were changing day by day. So the normal decision making processes that palliative care teams would have utilized were simply overwhelmed, and things changed day in and day out. One way that really showed up was inconsistent visitor restrictions. So those restrictions went in place, but they weren't always enforced in the same way, which would lead to additional complications in terms of everything that was going on at that phase of the pandemic. When one thing is supposed to be happening with visitors, and yet many people are showing up or people aren't showing up, and it became very, very complicated. Another piece that plays into this, of course, was the exposure fears for others. And that's just not only the risk to self, but of course, the fear that many healthcare workers had early in the pandemic and may still have around if they're exposed and they contract the virus, what does that mean for their friends or their family members or even their other staff that they're working with. And this really gets into the core of the moral distress definition, but is the doing counseling for healthcare staff on non-beneficial treatment in response to families' emotional reactions. And the chaplains in this study saw this again and again. Many of you have probably seen this in your own practice, where medically there's an indicated treatment that will or won't work, and it may be continued due to emotional reasons and distress that, again, that so many people were under during the pandemic, apart from any normal palliative care hospice sort of planning processes. And then lastly there, advising staff around shifting to comfort measures only, and families really being influenced by a desire for presence. And that just gets back to so many family members weren't able to be in the room with their loved ones as they were sick or as they were dying. And so that would mean, that however people could come up with that creatively, sometimes through various forms of video chatting or audio calls or things of that sort. Next slide, please. So some dimensions, again, of burnout that came up will vary. What we looking at, the definitions of burnout are kind of built into the slide here, but the core components of that coming from emotional exhaustion, which what we saw in this group of palliative care chaplains, of course, was the tiredness, the uncertainty, the strained capacity, and again, this was across the healthcare system of where they may have had a normal workflow for palliative care consults early on in the pandemic. Their capacity to do those was just so overwhelmed. Sometimes they didn't even know where to start. Within the exhaustion, there was those continual concerns for families, those not being able to be there with their loved ones as they were sick or dying, and all the complications that came from being on the COVID team. One piece, depersonalization didn't come up so much, so we aren't going to talk about that. But the other part that came out was this low sense of personal accomplishment. And for some of these folks, it meant that rather than being there in the room, it means they were working from home. In some cases, systems were so overwhelmed that consults weren't going in that normally would have gone in, so that care that could have been provided wasn't being provided. And then, of course, early in the pandemic, the lack of knowledge across the board about the virus and all the different implications, both for patients and staff as well. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the other component that came out of these interviews gets into moral injury, which I'll briefly define here. And that comes out of some of Jonathan Shea's and Brett Litz's work. And moral injury as a construct really has primarily been studied in service members and veteran population. But about 4 or 5 years ago, it started to pick up some interest looking at physicians and other healthcare workers. And the pandemic, in its own way, really paved the way for the exploration and study of moral injury in healthcare workers as a whole. Defining moral injury can get into three different areas. One is the sense of violating one's own personal, could be personal, professional, religious, ethical values or beliefs. And that's an important nuance from the moral distress definition, and that moral distress really only comes from a violation of a professional value or ethic. Moral injury can include the violation of a personal value ethic, wherever that comes from. So there could be the self piece of that. There could be the other piece, seeing someone else violating values that you hold sincere or dear, and what that can bring about. And lastly, there's the betrayal component of feeling betrayed by an authority figure or figures in a high stakes situation. And this goes beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, but I think it is important to note that there's ongoing dialogue and research being done about moral distress, moral injury, and burnout as to which is what. But in terms of our this sample set and what came out of these interviews, we really saw this component of these hotspot limitations, which a core component or a frequent theme in moral injury is the sense of feeling helpless, of not being able to do more in terms of what you would like to do in a given situation. So that came out quite a bit in terms of the lack of staffing, both within the palliative care teams themselves, but of course the overall health systems. Seeing the social restrictions that took place in terms of personal lives. We already mentioned under moral distress, the fear of potentially infecting others, and has already come out the census was so high and the deaths were happening so quickly that being overwhelmed, or again feeling helpless to address what they would have liked to do in that situation. Other components of this that came out were, again, challenges around decision making, which paralleled some of the moral distress pieces, and again the implications and the ramifications of these deaths, both in terms of the families and of all the healthcare staff in these palliative care teams, are things that are still playing out today, which is almost 2 years later at this point. Next slide, please. So here, in terms of what we saw in terms of these interviews about the ways that inpatient palliative care chaplains functions, we saw things related to how they relate to patients and family care in terms of optimization, how they were able to do that through fostering community and doing that through very non-conventional means, such as through video conferencing or telephones when families weren't able to be there as their loved ones were sick or dying. And then, of course, as part of their staff care role, really checking in with teams, both informally and formally, being able to care for them as best they could, as everyone was so overwhelmed early on in the pandemic. And we'll go to the next slide, please. So lastly, some of the takeaways from our first half of our session today is that seeing the way that chaplains change their practice and how they did things during the pandemic on a palliative care team, and how they adjusted to the needs of the moment in really impressive and incredible ways that I know many of you probably did in your own work environments too. We saw chaplains, even in these very intense moments, caring both for themselves and starting to engage other members of the healthcare team and palliative care teams around those different constructs of workplace distress. Again, whether that was moral injury, whether it was moral distress, or whether that was burnout. And again, we really saw that chaplains were reiterated as community partners in palliative care and healthcare as a whole, in terms of helping and working with families and palliative teams with decision-making processes, providing care for all of those, both patients, families, and team members as they were experiencing religious and spiritual struggle, and really coordinating that emotional support with other chaplains for optimal care. And I believe that completes my part, so I will step back here and we will move on to our next presenters.
Thank you, Tim and Dirk. It is a privilege to be your colleague and a pleasure to be able to do research together with you. So we are going to hand the baton off here to our colleagues here for the presentation on self-compassion, realizing the benefits for our patients, our teams, and ourselves. And again, in addition to some research being covered to introduce the subject matter, there'll be some conversation about conceptual structuring of self-compassion, but also, again, oodles of excitement for that you're going to be able to practice this as well today here live with us. So I'm going to introduce the presenters for this presentation with us today. First, Dr. Kristin Edwards serves as the Chief Wellness Officer and Medical Director of Palliative Care at Yale New Haven Health at the Bridgeport Hospital. Dr. Edwards has been the Medical Director of Palliative Care at the Bridgeport Hospital since 2014. Her interest in alleviating suffering for patients and families naturally extended to an interest in alleviating suffering for clinicians. And in July 2020, she was named Bridgeport Hospital's inaugural Chief Wellness Officer. In this role, she partners with senior leaders to improve workplace culture and efficiency to support well-being and broaden access to individual well-being tools. Dr. Edwards, Kristin, it's a pleasure to have you with us here. Next, at least on the paperwork that I'm reading, is Dr. Bostic, Terence. He's managing partner at CMA Global Incorporated. I meant to Google that, I didn't, but I'm delighted you are with us here right now. Dr. Bostic is trained in both clinical and industrial organizational psychology. He holds a Bachelor of Science from the College of William and Mary, a Master of Science from Bucknell University, and a doctorate from St. Louis University. He is a licensed psychologist in Missouri and is repeatedly published as a principal author in international peer-reviewed journals on issues related to stress management, personal resiliency, and psychological well-being. He's also a member of the American Psychological Association, the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, and the Society for Consulting Psychology. Again, welcome, Dr. Bostic. Great to have you with us, Terence. And when I watch Jerry Paul podcast, I know both Eric Wadera and Alex Smith always make a big deal when people are kind of new to it. So Kristin and Terence, I think you're new to the Transforming Chaplaincy webinar, so great to have you. But an old hand and somebody who's on the steering committee for the Hospice Palliative Spiritual Care Research Network, again, a mighty thanks to you for that, Reverend Hyman, is Katie Hyman. She is the Director of Palliative Care at Memorial Care Long Beach Medical Center, which is a part of the Memorial Care Health System in Southern California, which up until recently I'd love to have been in, given the weather we have here in Minnesota. So Reverend Hyman helped also develop the Spiritual Care Toolkit for the Center to Advance Palliative Care. Please check out the website to find that out. And she has worked on operational, procedural, legal, and clinical issues within palliative care. She has particular interest in education and interdisciplinary care, especially in communication training. And to that effect, she is a senior faculty member with Vital Talk. Again, thank you so much for being with us. Look forward to your presentation.
Okay, so welcome. It is our great privilege to speak to you today about self-compassion and how we can realize these benefits for our patients, our teams, and specifically ourselves. Next slide, please. Self-compassion has always been a really important part of well-being, but perhaps more than ever before now, as we certainly saw with the previous presentation. Many of those words rang true for me in my role as a Chief Wellness Officer and palliative care physician at our hospital. What I saw during the pandemic, especially during those early days, but even now, is that many people evaluated their worth based on what they could achieve or their ability of what they used to be able to achieve despite the shifting context of a global pandemic and its aftermath. Today, the three of us hope to give you an overview of self-compassion, to name a little bit of the what it is, the why behind some of the research, and then Katie will give us a glimpse into a tool that we can use to apply to our own environments. But our two biggest reminders here today are important. So one is that if you take away nothing else from this, is that each of us deserves to be loved for the simple fact that we are human beings. And the second is that learning to love ourselves helps us love others even better. Next slide, please. So practicing self-compassion doesn't take away from our compassion for others. It's not a competition, and compassion is not a limited resource. There's this myth that practicing self-compassion is selfish, and that's largely rooted in a misunderstanding of what self-compassion actually is. It's not this either or phenomenon. We don't practice either compassion for others or compassion for ourselves. Next, please. In fact, practicing self-compassion truly grows our ability to be more compassionate to others. As you learn to speak to yourself with kindness and without judgment, your ability to use that skill for other people and to approach them with kindness and without judgment grows. Next slide. But this isn't easy stuff. I know this group in particular knows that we're all works in progress. Terence, Katie, and I are here to speak to you about this, but we're by no means perfect. In all honesty, this is pretty normal, and it's pretty common to be self-critical. There's a 98% chance that I'll be kicking myself for something I said during this presentation after it's over. But we call it practicing because it's a skill. And just like any skill, when you do it over and over, it becomes integrated and it becomes almost automatic. So we encourage you to use these tools and practice it. Next slide. Okay, so here's the what. So what is self-compassion anyway? Self-compassion as a research definition has three main components. The founder of really one of the main research in self-compassion is Dr. Kristin. Her website is the selfcompassion.org. She has a lot of the additional information on it. These three components are self-kindness. This refers to the tone of how we speak to ourselves. The opposite of that is self-judgment. So you want to use a kind tone as opposed to a judging one. So let me give you a little example. And this one has happened to me. You've had a long day, you're driving home, you're on the parkway, freeway, throughway, whatever it is in your geographical region, and you're a little distracted and you miss your exit. And as you miss it, the self-judgment says, oh, you idiot, how could you have done that? Now you're gonna have to turn around, you're gonna be late to dinner, and you just go rattling off on all these things that are wrong with you because of it. That's the self-judgment. The tone of self-kindness is a little bit different. Instead, you say, oops, you made a mistake, well, I'll do it. All right, let's get to the next exit and turn around. So there's this misconception that if we use the first one, and maybe not in that example, but in some other areas of our life, that that motivates us. And the second one is kind of giving ourselves a free pass. But if you really think about it, criticizing and shaming anybody never leads to more motivation, including ourselves. The second element of self-compassion is common humanity and appreciating our common humanity. So this, unfortunately or fortunately, is that pain, suffering, and failure is a part of the human experience. We all go through it. The opposite of this is isolation. And so when you recognize that you are part of humanity, when you feel these things, it helps combat that isolation. The isolation, or the opposite, the isolation is a feeling that you're different somehow for feeling these things or experiencing these things. If you go back to that example, the comment of, oh, we all make mistakes, is actually a moment of appreciating the common humanity, that we are all fallible as human beings. Finally, the third component of this definition is mindfulness. In this context, mindfulness does not refer to yoga and meditation, although that is an excellent way to develop a sense of mindfulness. But rather it's a measured and equilibrated response to the emotions that we have. It's not minimizing the emotions, but not exaggerating them. It's recognizing, okay, I'm frustrated because I missed that exit, but it's not making them bigger than they need to be. So allowing them to wash over us and not get swept up in it. Those three components are really the essential of most of the research that's done in self-compassion through Dr. Neff. There was a fourth element that was added. It's not a research contract, but a really good article in the Harvard Business Review that came out in January of 2021. And that highlighted this element of self-trust. Self-trust really just refers to giving yourself the benefit of the doubt when it comes to intentions and abilities for the things that you do. Next slide, please. So I find it really helpful to also talk about, well, what isn't self-compassion? Next. Self-compassion is not self-pity. Self-pity is actually a turning inwards and focusing only on one's own problems, so it's a disconnection. And this actually leads to feelings of disconnection and exacerbating those feelings so they're even bigger. Next. Self-compassion is not self-indulgence. It might feel nice to have that tub of ice cream after a long, hard day, but that is not what it means to take care of your needs in the longer term for well-being and happiness. If you, again, going back to that sort of self-flagellation, we try to motivate ourselves by shame, that almost always backfires until you're ready to accept the parts of yourself that you view as a little more unsavory. Next. Self-compassion is not self-esteem. Self-esteem is related to our sense of self-worth, our perceived value, and really how much we like ourselves. In the self-compassion, in contrast, is based on that we're worthy of kindness and love simply for our humanity. In the modern Western world, much of our concepts of self-esteem are actually built around being able to distinguish ourselves or be different. Self-compassion is actually the opposite. It's we deserve it because we're just like everyone else. And that's what I think is really cool about these two distinctions here. Terence is going to go into a lot more of the research than I am, but I think one of the things that's really cool about self-compassion research is that the self-compassion versus self-esteem, self-compassion is actually more effective at creating emotional resilience, accurate self-concepts, caring relationships, as well as less narcissism and less reactive anger. One of the other key things about self-esteem is that it's really dependent on how we view our accomplishments in the moment. So if you've had a recent failure, you don't have as high self-esteem. It's dependent on your sense of accomplishment. Self-compassion, because it's based on your humanity and that doesn't fluctuate, is always present. In fact, when you fall flat on your face, that is exactly when self-compassion is available to you, and that's when you can use it to its greatest advantage. Next slide. And lastly, self-compassion is definitely not selfish. If you haven't seen these two, I would hope that you have, but this comes from the movie Moana. The woman on the right is Tafiti, the woman on the left is Taka. They're actually one and the same. The one on the right is when she has her heart back in her place. And I like to think of, if you were walking down the street, which one of these would you rather run into? I don't know about you, I think it would be the one on the right. When we're practicing self-compassion, we turn a little bit more into this person on the right. Self-compassion does not take a lot of time. And so if you spend a few moments reconfiguring the way you're framing how you talk to yourself, and you turn more into that woman on the right, then that is not a selfish act. You're actually doing it for longevity and sustainability in the work that we do. And I believe that is it. I'm going to turn it over to Terence for the next slides.
Thank you very much. I just want to say first, I'm honored to be with a group that's so distinguished and dedicated as chaplains. I'll be brief, but just a little bit of history. So for the first years of my career, I worked on the physical medicine and rehab floor, and my partner on the cross-functional team was always the chaplain, because we were sort of the people that were responsible for the mood and the welfare of the patients while they were there convalescing. So it's great to be back with the people that I think of as my brothers and sisters. So my role in the talk today is I want to present a little bit of what the research is telling us, because this is a place where social science is really investing pretty heavily and doing a lot of research, because it pays a great deal of discipline. It pays a great deal of dividends. I think sometimes, one of the jokes we make in psychology is we're the social science that tries to prove it's real science by doing research. And we are doing a lot more research on this. It appears that there's both individual and organizational benefits to better understanding self-compassion. So we wanted to present a couple of those highlights here. Next slide, please. All right. So the first is, why is it good for you all as practitioners, as professionals, and as individuals to practice this? If you look at the research, it kind of comes down to a couple of different factors. Is that people that are more effective at practicing self-compassion are more likely to demonstrate a growth mindset. And if you haven't seen or heard anything about growth mindset, just go to YouTube and type in the word growth mindset. It's a great concept. I think we stole it from educational psychology, but the idea is that I shouldn't be good at something that I haven't tried before. It's the act of getting better that's important. So, if we can think about this as another pathway into having a growth mindset, that's a real win. One of the ways I like talking about growth mindset is if you can think about something you did in your past that makes you cringe, that's evidence that you have a growth mindset. Right? Because it's cringeworthy now, but at the time it seemed reasonable. And I think all of us can come up with a cringeworthy memory from when we were 20. So there's evidence we've all got a growth mindset. Here's a great way to sort of make the most of it. The second one is authentic self. Self-compassionate people appear to be more of that sort of true authentic self, as opposed to some persona that you try to strap on when you go into the hospital, go into the clinic, go into your workplace. People that are more likely to be their authentic self are both viewed more favorably by others, and it's just long-term more sustainable. When you look at a lot of the research on sort of employee engagement and employee satisfaction, it is about, I'm able to be my authentic self when I come to work. So this is another way that you can show up and be more of who you actually are, which is better for you and better for others. It appears to help with emotional intelligence. You know, this would be a phrase that was new about 25 years ago. Hopefully we all talk about it a lot now. It's the ability to recognize and have some influence over our emotional experience, and recognize and have some influence over the emotional experience of other people. People that are good at self-compassion seem to show more emotional intelligence. We believe that that's a circular feedback model, is one begets the other, begets the other. And lastly, job satisfaction. I think Kristin's example about missing an exit on the way home is a great one. You know, experience means making a lot of mistakes. And if you have a voice in your head that will allow that to be a productive experience as opposed to a shameful experience, it's going to make it easier for you to have a good experience at the workplace, which is good for you. It's good for your family. It's good for your patients. It's good for your colleagues. So here's our pitch as to why this matters, at least for you individually, as people that are more practiced this tend to find these 4 benefits. Next slide, please. If you're in a leadership role, the impact's even more important, because you get all of those things that we just listed. Plus, we're starting to research what happens if you're in a leadership role and you are more practiced at this. In general, I mean, no surprise, you're going to be seen as a more compassionate leader, and more compassionate leaders are people that usually build better followership. They're the people that folks want to work for, and they tend to attract other like-minded people to the organization and their departments. If you look at the research on team engagement, team satisfaction, is when a leader is seen as having good self-compassion, that team will be more engaged, more active, and they'll enjoy their work better. They'll have stronger relationships. There's an old expression, I think it's actually in the management literature, not in the psychology literature, is that people join organizations, but they leave managers. If bosses that are seen as more compassionate are more likely to have that extra tether to an employee when they're having their bad day, and can be a little bit stronger for them. And it's also going to create stronger relationships too, across departments, you know, with your patients or your clients that you're serving. And the last one that I like, and you know, I think there's a little bit of a tie back to the talk we had at the beginning of this, is people are seen as more moral, that their work is more centered, it's more ethical. I think compassion is probably an underlying principle across a lot of different faith traditions. So this allows you to bring that in, you know, into your personal experience, into your leadership experience. Next slide, please. So what seems to help? You know, the people that are researching this, the phrase they use, I think it's a little funny, is they're trying to weaponize positive psychology. How do we take these things we know in positive psychology and do something productive with them? It appears the 2 things that have the greatest impact with the least effort appear to be journaling and affirmations. So it's really taken some time to journal after that setback and kind of intentionally engage in the right kind of dialogue around it. Again, to the point that Kristin made a few minutes ago, that self-talk really matters, right? And the more you do it, the more ingrained it is. And when you write it down, that's 10 times better than just thinking it. And the affirmation, the actual saying the words out loud or to yourself, that this is hard. I'm not alone. I'm part of a community. Those words really do matter, and it's important for you to hear them inside of your head, and it's important for others to hear them as well too. They're pretty easy. You don't have to carry a lot of tools to do them, and they appear to be the 2 that have the greatest impact with the least amount of effort. Next slide. All right. So last slide for me is, you know, we really think that self-compassion is probably an underrepresented part of the human experience. And it's what makes us human. And, you know, when you work with a lot of high performing individuals, which will oftentimes be the leaders of the departments or the executives in the organization, you know, these are folks who aren't really good at making mistakes. They don't have a whole lot of comfort with their own failings and setbacks, or at least they're more visible about it than everybody else. But we like this because it really ties us back to just the humanity of being a person. And there's 7 billion of us. And sometimes a little bit more self-understanding and understanding of others would make the world a better place. So there's my pitch. There's what social science is saying about this. Erwin Hyman.
All right.
For the balance of my time to you.
Apologize for the airplane overhead. Dirk and I have lots of things going outside of our offices today. I want to take a minute and talk about some practical applications of this for our work as professionals. Many of you may be chaplains, so I'll add that angle also. I think we're really good at compassion. as chaplains, probably particularly in the field of palliative care too. It's a thing that we do, and we're pretty practiced at it. We're not necessarily always aware of what the skills are, naming them. And so that's why I think grounding ourselves in the concepts and the structures and the research is really critical before we can put this into practice, because compassion is not magic. It's not magic when we offer it to our patients. It's not magic when we offer it to our colleagues. Compassion is a skill. And if we can name it, then we can replicate it. And if we can replicate it, then we can teach it. And these are going to be especially critical, I think, for chaplains and for palliative care providers as we're moving into this next phase of pandemic, endemic, because we're going to need to have some culture shifts around this. So we're going to need to be able to teach this. And if we can teach it, then we have to be able to do it ourselves also. So I will say sometimes we're going to use and model these self-compassion skills just by way of using our professional or pastoral, for some of us, authority, where you may step in and interrupt somebody's script, somebody's monologue about, God, that was so stupid. I can't believe that I did that. We can easily interrupt that and say something like that. That sounds like actually a pretty normal reaction to a stressful situation. We do that all the time. Now learning how to do that for ourselves and then being able to teach it to patients too. Being able to say, can I offer you this tool so that when you get stuck in that mindset, you can offer this to yourself and practice it. Okay, so I am going to ask. I know that some of you are eating lunch right now. I know that some of you are finishing up notes or emails, and you have this going on in the background and you're listening with somewhere between 30 and 70% of your brain. I'm going to ask that for 60 seconds, you stop all the other things that you're doing, that you close all the other open screens on your desktop, that you put down your phone, that you put down your sandwich. This is really a pretty efficient tool. I'm not going to ask you to journal. So take a minute, take less than 60 seconds. And if you can take us to the next slide, please. I want you to think of a moment recently that is, as Terence said, your cringe moment. Sometime in the last day, sometime in the last week. Something that you feel embarrassed about or stressed about. Picture the scene around you, picture the people, picture where you physically were, and let yourself move back into the emotions and the feelings of that moment. Now take a minute and see if you can locate where the stress is in your body. Maybe it's in your jaw, maybe it's in your shoulders, maybe it's in your gut. And then take a minute to just name what's going on in yourself. You can say, this is a moment of suffering. Or you might say, I'm feeling really embarrassed. Now say to yourself, this is a normal reaction. Or other people are also suffering right now. And last, if you can take your hand and either put it on your heart, or you may want to put it on the place where you feel the stress, your stomach, your head, but make contact with yourself and say, may I be kind to myself in this moment? Or picture what you would say if a friend told you this, or a patient, what your compassionate response would be to them. All right. Andy, would you take us to the next slide, please? We are going to offer you this as a step-by-step tool that you can take and employ. You can teach to your teams. You can teach to the other folks on your units. You can offer it to your patients. When I practice this, when I remember to practice this, it is helpful for me that I don't have to be in a quiet room alone for 15 minutes. That's not a super common situation in my current life. But I can do this washing my hands between patients. I can do this while I'm walking from one meeting to the next, because it really can take 30 seconds to move from mindfulness, which is the not suppressing, the not professional suppressing, where we're not supposed to feel things. We're supposed to just move on and separate. So to ground yourself in that, to feel connected to the other suffering in the world, and then to have the moment of self-kindness where you just offer that to yourself. And that can be done really discreetly and also really quickly. I think this is critical, and I encourage you all to try this at least once in the next 24 hours, because we can't really teach with authenticity or integrity unless we're willing to try it out on ourselves and keep working on it. We have a couple of, next slide, Andy. From the three of us, these were our favorite quotations about self-compassion. I'm not going to read them to you, but this slide and then the next slide, Andy, will be available to you by email. We will, Paul and Andy will send these out. So additional resources for you to practice and share with your teams. So thank you all for your time. I think we're throwing it back to Paul.
I'm all for catching, especially nowadays. You may have seen that I used a baseball slide in the beginning. I'm somebody who's a bit overjoyed that Major League Baseball is back. So again, Terence, Kristin, and Katie, thank you so much. Dirk and Tim, if you're still on the line, great to have you with us. Friends, if you want to send us questions, I'm checking the question box, and thank you for the kind words about the presentation. If any of you have questions, please do send them our way. And for any of us people who've been panel presenters here, if we have questions for one another, I would certainly welcome that too. I just have to say at the outset here, Katie, you totally nailed me as a webinar listener. I am somebody who tries to do that multitasking as well. Like, oh, I'll keep it on in the background. And I didn't know that 30 to 70% little nugget of a stat there, so I appreciate that. I also appreciate that kinesthetic component. I have to say that I am naive to self-compassion. I haven't tried it before, so that was a nice initiation into the material as well as to the process. So I appreciate that.
Paul, did you see the newest question that came in?
No, take it, Dirk.
This is from Will. Do you have advice for helping to implement some of this wisdom in this presentation to assist with staff retention in hospice and palliative care? So how can we relate this to staff retention?
I think that's me. You know, in the organizations that I've seen use this best for, you know, what we would think of kind of more as the industrial organizational side of psychology, it's typically cascaded down or it's cascaded up, and both can work equally well. But it's usually the department, the division, sort of showing a commitment, like here's a way that we're going to treat ourselves, sort of some new rules of engagement. And you can either start that out at the very top of the organization or the top of whatever the team is, you know, so, you know, it could be, I'm making this up, but, you know, the directors of chaplaincy could get together and decide that we want this to be a way that we're going to treat each other. And then they, you know, they go through some work around cementing those behaviors and being more consistent with them. And then you cascade that down with workshops. The other way you can do it is you can start more grassroots, is we're going to all learn this new skill together, and it starts from the front line and you can sort of work its way up. But it really seems to have its impact. You know, we broadly think about it as in kind of in the culture change bucket. So it's a 1 to 3 year initiative to do that. But the big part is just getting everyone to agree that it's the common language we're going to use with each other, and we're all going to practice these behaviors and be in it together, and expect that you probably wouldn't see the result in turnover for 1 to 3 years. But then at that point, it should, as long as you can keep up with it, it should last kind of forever, because it's a new way that we're all going to speak and treat with each other. Kristin, Katie, you all have experiences that are different than that?
No, I mean, differently, of course, different lens than you have. But I think I think everything you said is spot on. I think the other thing I would think about when I think about our palliative care community is really helping people come up with the fact that they weren't able to do as much in the pandemic, and sitting with that and being comfortable with it. There was a really good article by David Weissman a number of years ago, probably 10, 15 years ago, called Martyrs in Palliative Care. And I think that's one area where many palliative care clinicians are so focused on other that they lose sight of also including themselves in that process, and that can lead to some burnout. And so I think when you do incorporate this, it helps to have people pace themselves in the career and help with that staff turnover from that perspective.
Kristin, I see a question that Kelly was asking if you can say more about how criticism doesn't motivate. Because I mean, I think criticism can be a tool for motivation, but you want to talk some about your insight about the difference for self-compassion?
Can you give me a little more on what you're pointing at, Katie? I mean, I think what I've seen is maybe criticism can be immediately motivating, but not long term, because the intrinsic motivation is going to come from elsewhere and from inside, and that's not the part. Terence, you may be able to answer this question even better than I am.
A learning theory question for a psychologist. This is why people won't talk to us at parties. Yes, that's a great learning theory question. So if you think about criticism as a negative reinforcer, criticism would be good for reducing a behavior, but not increasing a behavior. And most behavior change in grown-ups is increasing a behavior, not reducing a behavior. So that criticism is broadly thought of as a punishment, right? So you're trying to punish a behavior. And also, all things being equal, positive reinforcement works 5 to 7 times better than negative reinforcement in most circumstances.
There's a comment, it's not a question in the chat, but I want to comment on it. So somebody put that they teared up while caring for himself or herself. And I would say, I just want to confess that I started to too, except I was on screen. And I think that just speaks to how powerful this brief interaction really can be, and that we don't exercise it enough. So kudos to you for being upfront. And, yes, I think it is a very powerful intervention.
Katie, did you see the question about pastoral authority in the Q&A? It's a little bit near the top.
Yeah, Arlene, I'm not totally sure if we're using this in the same way. I'll say when I use pastoral authority, as a phrase, I mean that in an intentional and ethical way, in the sort of the recognition that we as chaplains, anybody coming into the patient's room as a healthcare professional or coming into the patient's home, wherever the encounter is, we have power in that, and we have some authority. And frequently as chaplains, I think what we're working to is to empower, to not have an agenda, to work with where people are and empower them, and that's good. There are moments, I think, where it can be helpful to quietly intervene to disrupt unhelpful scripts that people are doing. And so that would be an example of what I meant by using pastoral authority and introducing this tool by way of sort of recognizing the power dynamic. I don't know, Paul or Dirk, do you have something to add to that from a practical standpoint?
I think you did.
You said it well.
You sussed it out well, Katie.
Okay.
Thank you. Friends, we are at that point. I think we tried to address many of the questions, and I so appreciate you sending those to us. I do want to thank all of you for coming and giving us your valuable time, whether it was that 30 or 70% that Katie referred to earlier, or all of you. So thanks very much to Dr. Bostic, to Dr. Edwards, to Reverend Hyman, to my colleagues, Reverend Lamoshain and Reverend Onset. I am so delighted to be here with you today, and hopefully we can do this again somehow another time. In the meantime, I hope to run into you, Terence, and hear about those learning theories while maybe having an adult beverage sometime.
Anytime. You'll regret that decision, but anytime.
All right. All right, everybody. Thanks so much. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
All right.
I'm not sure I know how to leave. Oh, good.